Okay, let's frame this up. So I'm vainly trying to approach having done with psychological types. And the motivation for that is because I'm sick of carrying it around in my bag. And I'm trying to get through chapter 5, the type problem in poetry, section B, the relativity of the God concept in Meister Eckhart, and section C, which is the nature of the uniting symbol in Spitler. And then we'll have done with psychological types. But hopefully, one is in a position to see from here the amount of material that I've already drawn upon as I attempt to integrate John Vervaeke, Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and Jamie Wheal into a coherent sort of evolution of Christian symbolism in light of the third millennium. Uh, like I've drawn out like already 20 episodes of material, and I'm now trying to also draw that together and integrate it and summarize it to a degree. And surprisingly, that's proving difficult. And so what I'm going to be doing today is going over some of the main points from the first three episodes in the series, and hopefully then going into the relativity of the God concept in Meister Eckhart, because the basic point from here ought to be, if anyone's playing along by paying attention, at least, for example, to the first half an hour of episode 19, that we don't want to get stuck in relativism. And like we don't want to get stuck in the fractionation of the Protestant church. And so the idea is that if it's true that the institutional church, or indeed any institution, has been telling a um, sort of self-limiting story, well, how can we include individual experiences? How can we include the perspective of the soul into occasions of communion without succumbing to relativism? This is sort of how do we integrate the individual and the collective, which is one of the main splits that we've been talking about through the whole time. And basically the answer is going to have to do with the role of the uniting symbol, and that the symbol rather than the institution ought to provide the form, the structure, the belonging in a sense. And certainly we can see this as adhering to the same form. But so the difference that I'm invoking is, hey, there are some deep symbols here, and we can certainly evoke Christian mysticism to talk about them if we wish to, although their elaboration and articulation is not limited to exegesis by Christian symbolism. And there is a key difference between the symbols which underlie, let's say, some of the functionality of an ecology of practices and the stories that we derive from that. As in, I'm connecting here stories with, if I just move into this now, let me see if I can pull this up. That should be shared with this part. Again, I won't go into it. I'm just leaving it there. Story is connected with procedure and also with duality, with narrative order, with the sense of purpose. And the idea would be rather than getting stuck in one story, which particularly in the Christian story sort of prevents us from taking the perspective of Lucifer and making the Christ and Lucifer duality transparent to us. Can we engage the the proper functionality of an ecology of practices to be able to work with any story, any story, which again is like a big if true claim. I'm not going to go into this again. I'm relying on the first half an hour of episode 19. And so what I am going to be going into is some of the notes from Episode one, to think or to feel. So we've been dealing with Jung a little bit, and why? Well, I've been studying Jung, and I'm now trying to escape his clutches so that I can move to study some other people because I'm kind of sick of Jung at the moment. Anyway, in episode one, we were discussing two different sets of opposites, which are basically Jung's point of view on the split in Western culture, Western psyche, and we discussed them in terms of, on the one hand, abstraction, the unnatural, unity, rational, superhuman, impersonal, and thinking, with Tertullian as a good example of the introverted thinker. It had to do with the philosophical position, realism. And on the other hand, we oppose the sensory, the natural, multiplicity, the irrational, the human, the personal, and feeling, with origin as a good example of the extroverted feeling type associated with the philosophical position, nominalism. And so basically the image that I'm working with here is one of trying to construct the the kind of circus tent that overlays the campsites or stops along the way of the philosophical Silk Road. So like this is a pretty old, it has to do with the archetype of the surface, the surface, the circus or the traveling caravan. These are, you know, the desert tribes that erect their tent wherever they happen to stop. And if we imagine that the tent surface is composed of a lattice, a network, then we see how it uh, converges into a kind of spiritual hierarchy that's directed toward the abstract, the unnatural, toward unity, toward the rational, toward the superhuman, toward the impersonal, and toward thinking. But it also extends downward toward the sensory, toward the natural, toward the multiplicitous, the irrational, the human, the personal, and the feeling. And so this is the image that I'm going to be working with. The soul is going to end up being a mediating middle layer between these two, and I'm going to be trying to flesh this out a little bit more. And so from the first episode, the basic insight through Jung is that our development, psychologically and sociologically, is typically imbalanced in one way or another. And Jung conceptualizes that by differentiation into four different functions or four different, let's say, classes, if you want to do sociological analysis, which I did a little. And there's a kind of overdevelopment of one of the functions, or indeed of one of the classes. We saw that in a brief analysis of Greek culture, where it's like the beauty and Apollonian sort of civilized and magnificent quality of the art and architecture and culture is sort of in gross distinction to the milieu in which it was embedded, as in the rest of the the multiplicitous public, the collective. And similarly in the individuals, it's like the development of like one function, which is how they fit into how they be the cog in the machine that they are, what they're valued for, at the expense of the other aspects of who they are. And so essentially Jung's basic diagnosis is to correct for that by recognizing the gain in consciousness that comes with the development of that one function or one class, let's say, but also by facilitating the safe development of the what Jung calls the inferior function, or indeed the other functions. The key would be without making a regression. So how can we preserve the gains in consciousness that have been made since the Holocene, while also restoring our access to the source of life that we've lost? That should essentially appear to be the same as Vervaeke's prescription, as far as I can tell. Because it's about getting back the functionality of what we've lost without losing what we've gained along the way. For Jung, it's specifically that the inferior function is what gives us best access to the unconscious, and he thinks that that creative matrix, that source of vitality and aliveness and symbols, is what we need to restore access to. Just Jungian language on something. We also had, okay, so from, yeah, again, the top uh, one of those lists that I was making having to do with the realist perspective, we get from that, we derive a normativity on shamanism, by which I mean anything we wish to talk about abstractly, we have to be able to get a coherent sense of using a combination of the four functions in groups. Why? Because if not, our ideas become detached from reality and we end up with a correspondence theory of truth and Kantian epistemology, which we're trying to outgrow, where ideas are not reality. So again, if we fall prey to sophistry, or if the logos is reduced in its power, then we get this split between our thinking and our sensing, our feeling and our intuiting. That means that we don't feel what I'm saying and we don't see what I'm saying. So this manner of speaking is actually a degraded form of something that we're trying to recover. So any idea, any abstraction, we need to be able to gather a coherent sense of that. Coherence being connected with the propositional layer in passing. Yeah, and that's sort of how to preserve, yeah, the way to preserve the connection between our abstractions and what we call reality itself, if you know what I mean, in the kind of Kantian way. The way to preserve that or to recover that through line between them, seamless continuity between reality and the idea, is by a restoration of shamanic practice. Um, Indigenous scholarship would have, like through Tyson Yunkaporta, for example, I'm thinking of the law of the land, that what's real is deeply bound to the place that we're in, and that the sense of coherence that we derive from our experience is deeply tied to the places that we inhabit, to the homes that we belong in. And I see this deep interconnection between the functionality of the logos and the role of place in establishing, for example, a viable worldview. I'm not going to go on about that. That was had to do with normativity on shamanism. Yeah, and so that normativity, that way that shamanism is supposed to fit in, I'm essentially saying as a kind of, let's say, higher form of language rather than what our language has devolved into, it's supposed to also preserve the viability of transcendence. Um, so there's a way, again, that things are supposed to go up into one whole. This is a spiritual hierarchy or bringing things within. This is Jung's introverting, withdrawing the libido away from the multiplicitousness of the world and bringing it in into one. And that has to do with unifying things into one whole. And that's what I mean, like our sense for that, our access to that, is what I mean by the viability of transcendence. It's that the experience of those kind of states and that way of experiencing the world, um, that's what the logos is supposed to be. That's one of the ways that the logos is supposed to draw things together and preserve the sustainability of culture itself, which I've articulated as a kind of verticality on the logos. It's still where the logos is still brought down and among the individuals. So it's democratized transcendence, which grounds the logos in reality rather than this dysfunction that we talked about in terms of the Knights of the Round Table, for example, where it's only about um, withdrawing away from the world. But yeah, there is a verticality that the logos exposes us to. Yeah, so that normativity on shamanism preserves the viability of transcendence, preserves our access to transcendent states, mystical experience. And by extension, we should be able to experience directly how I and we and God are of the same essence, in the sense that the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me, without devaluing the human as lesser or lower than God. So this is the resolution to the kind of transubstantiation issue from episode one. We talked about that in terms of the history of Christianity, where there is sense of the sameness or shared essence of the I and the we and the transcendent or divine or sacred, where the differences that we can also be conscious of don't have to come with a value judgment or self-evaluation as being lesser than God, which is kind of big news in or to a lot of people. And here I'm drawing a little from After Socrates, episode 4, having to do with the philosophy of illumination. I forget the name of the Islamic scholar that John was talking about, who they also burned. The idea is that, yeah, that the light by which we see, like it's light is that by which we see. We never see light. And in the same way, the eye frames everything that we see. We see through that eye. And so the ground of the ego, the eye by which we frame things, is actually the same as the ground of being Paul Tillich's term. And if we can sense that, if we can build our sense for that, then we don't have this dualistic split between I and we and God, for example, where we can appreciate the differences in the qualities between ourselves and the divine without relying on a notion like original sin, for example. This would be part of a prescription. So that had to do with realism, so taking from the realist perspective. Whereas from nominalism, we basically wanted to take this appreciation for the natural rather than the supernatural in terms of, for example, with transcendent naturalism. It's kind of the whole point here is to this is the scientific uh, modus operandi, if you like, is that there's something to matter. There's something about the multiple forms that is worth appreciating and investigating. So this is a way of valuing the many actual forms and participation in and among those forms. And so the idea is that the logos, and I think the logos as attendant upon dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practice, not just shamanic dialogical practice. I think the logos can show up in such a way as to help us to engage, not just withdraw, to uncover, unveil the uniqueness of things, to appreciate the actuality of every object, how it fits into the interconnected network. Um, and that's a kind of, rather than a verticality on the logos, I've articulated this as a kind of horizontality connected with eros that leads to a kind of proper proportioning of empathy rather than abstraction. So where eros is sort of properly organized in again the lattice work of the tent. Um, where again, like we're sort of I'm talking about the proper distribution of empathy and connection into our relationships with real objects. Um, and not just objects. I won't talk about transjectivity here, but basically, it's a way to properly organize eros, and that can still be because again, the risk with an overfocus on nominalism would be entropy, that our energy flows out and is dissipated among the multiple, among samsara, among Maya, among the illusion, among the 10,000 things. And so the idea here is that we're looking for this combination of form and essence that can properly distribute and apportion eros, empathy, uh, feeling. Again, there's a lot to eros, but while also organizing it and cohering it. And that shamanism can play a role in both sides of that. Again, this is trying to articulate some combination of realism and nominalism. And we basically get to the insight through episode 1, which I'm reviewing at the moment, that basically can't be facilitated in institutional form. So where the unity of the human and the divine, the sameness of identity between them was sort of connected with the doctrine of original sin. And that doctrine was sort of through Augustine and others One of the main ways that the church established its institutional power and authority, it was sort of administering the grace of God for the salvation of the masses. And although we can get behind that salvation of the masses as a sort of democratization of um, the divine, but we also have a sense of our value and our moral freedom. Um, and I think that's exactly what should flow from our direct access to the transcendent. There should be a clear through line between our both convergent but also individualized access to the transcendent that preserves our sense of shared essence with the divine and with the collective, but without devaluing the human and the personal. Again, it's all very well to sort of state that this is what we're looking for, but we're hoping to turn this into functional practice. And that's going to be toward which I'm trying to articulate toward that. How do we tie this into a functional ecology of practices designed to explicitly redress this split, which is, again, one angle on the split that we've inherited from Jung. Yeah, and so what I'm trying to do here is to identify the functionality that comes from each of the sides of realism and nominalism and explore how we can establish these opponent processing relationships that result in a reciprocal opening between them rather than, the dysfunctionality that we see in the cult of individualism, for example. That's not what I'm suggesting. Um, on the other hand, it would be the institutional dogma of the church. I'm saying, hey, the solution can't be uh, tyrannical, oppressive, authoritarian dogma where our souls don't actually get an opportunity to express themselves, but it also can't be anarchy. That's not a solution either. So, how do we find something that actually works? And so, what I'm implying here is that the institutions, qua institutions, as in their form of institutions, they come with certain baggage, which I'm connecting with like being tied to a certain form of sociology and also particular stories. They come with a baggage that deepens the split that we've inherited. And what that implies is that we don't just need new stories, we need the capacity to work with any story, and that a new manner of social organization is required to facilitate that. Because the the institutional forms and then the factions that resist them, Republicans and separatists or something like that, the empire and the rebels, we end up getting attached to those identities and unable to take the opposite perspectives. And we're going to have to let not only those stories go, although the thing is that it's just one story. I'm not saying there's anything particularly wrong with that story, although there is, but it's not about ragging on one particular story. It's about saying, hey, how can we work with any story? Um, how can we get above and beyond? How can we embed ourselves in narrative identity, narrative order, but also be able to take perspectives on the identity that we are comfortable with, familiar with, the identities I can then add. So yes, a new manner of social organization, new sociology to go along with new culture. Basically, new culture designed to redress the split requires new hardware. It requires new social hardware as well as new cultural software. It doesn't work without the hardware. We can't just, add online meetings as well. Like we can't just, it's all very well this is why the prescription is for an ecology of practices in a community of practitioners in a monastery model with a viable worldview, rooted in place in a sense of belonging with stable community. It doesn't work unless we have all of that. One element of that is not enough. Been trying to articulate a bit of why that is, which I'm going to keep doing. Episode 2, ideas and things. And this is the first part where Jung starts to articulate an alternative to either of those two. So rather than getting trapped in them, the alternative would be, again, there's a kind of three-stage model here. Again, I described the tent that I was working with as a symbol, but then also it's kind of this through a lot of I mean, this is actually global, worldwide. The heaven, human, and earthly aspects of the world, where here psyche or anima would be connected with the human layer, the layer of the soul, which is again sort of mediating the split between heaven and earth, or in this context, realism and nominalism. Yeah, and so the psyche or the anima is a sort of mediating force between the idea and the thing, between reason and experience. And so rather than reducing one pole to the other, we can emphasize the soul's function of holding the creative tension between opposites. And I've already connected at length the connection between being able to take up the perspective of the soul or of the divine double, if you prefer, and the capacity for perspective taking itself. Yep. That three layer model, I said the earthly, the human or the soulful, and the heavenly can also be rendered body, soul, and spirit. And in episode two, which is again ideas and things, this is where I discussed balancing masculinity and femininity. Um, in the model that we've been using, masculinity would be connected with heaven and femininity with the earth, logos and eros similarly, abstraction and empathy similarly. Um, yeah, so it's in the terms of the relationship between two and three here. And I map that across this three layer stack from Marvin Harris, cultural materialism, infrastructural, social structural, and superstructural, which basically corresponds to the same, but in terms of civilizational design. And I map that in terms of three different classes of mystical experience that have to do with the proper balance between those different pairs, masculine, feminine, logos, eros, abstraction, empathy. In terms of three classes of mystical experience, namely the introvert sort of going out into mystical, extroverted mystical union with the multiplicity of nature, where the presence of a more realist orientation in that context would look like um, being present to the unity within within that kind of an experience. It's opening to the oneness. Whereas the other pole, which is the nominalist or feminine pole in this context, would look like appreciating the diversity and the individuality, the uniqueness of the natural forms. But there were two others. That was the lower of the three layers. The middle layer has to do with mystical experience that has to do with the group bonding. So like being with the other human bodies and faces and personalities and like hanging out, singing and dancing, for example, being together, where again, it's this balance between experiencing states of group bonding, unity, oneness together, and appreciating the uniqueness, the diversity of the individual humans. Um, Caitlin Thomas. Someone is calling me. 1 second. Sorry about that. That should have been the second of three layers, where the middle layer was about um, yeah, so states of communitas group bonding that can both cohere the group into a sense of the whole, but also appreciate the diversity, uniqueness, individuality of all the different members who are present. These are again classes of mystical experience. And the third being the top layer. And it's sort of the trickiest at the moment, where it's sort of states of introversion into not going out into nature, but sort of being within, sort of Terence McKenna's like 5 grams in silent darkness kind of prescription, where the realist side of it would be again appreciating oneness, unity, numinosity. This would be in terms of the mystical experience questionnaire from Johns Hopkins, which has 4 different uh, factors that go into um, mystical experience. I'm not going to go into that here. The other one is a little bit harder here. The sense of the multiplicity or uniqueness or unity. That's going to come out a little bit more clearly in Eckhart, where we talk about like the deeper that we go into our individuality, the deeper that we go into, let's say, the sense of God. Um, I'm not going to go further into all that here. I was just sort of laying out again one of the models that came out of episode two that was linking Marvin Harris with three classes of mystical experience based on body, soul, and spirit, or earth, human, and heaven. Yeah, and so this is the place where we first start to link the mediating capacity of the soul, or that middle layer that we were talking about. And so where the soul is clearly linked from this point to the function of symbols and that of fantasy. This is the stuff about serious play. Um, Vervaeke's episode 18 on Gnosticism in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is relevant there. And so this is like sort of Jung's notion as the imagination as a kind of living creative bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, the inner and outer worlds, the idea and reality. And sort of symbolic mediation is central to Jung's idea of psychological wholeness. And that basically has relevance for how individuals and collectives resolve deep internal divides. So the idea is that by learning how to take up the perspective of the soul, that we not only gain the capacity to take perspectives on the stories or identities that we have been uh, stuck within, but that we also gain a facility with playfulness, with joyousness, with spontaneity, with the quality of innocence, these childlike qualities, that we gain a facility with symbolic logic, with participation in symbols, with the experience of the of Henry Corbin's the imaginal world, um, where we get access to what Jung would call the unconscious. So by taking up the perspective of the soul, we get to enter into communion with the unconscious, and it's by allowing our creativity, our individuality, our uniqueness to flow through us that we can ultimately create these forms that can be shared, that we can get shared participation, but also individuality, as in groups when we can meet in the perspective of the soul, then what happens? Okay, that's all sort of roughly going together for me. And then, yep. So this is sort of some of what I'm talking about. This gets us normativity on intentional practice designed to help us take up the perspective of the soul and facilitate serious play. That helps us to understand how we can rebalance our own development, where individual development can be optimized and supported for the sake of, as in, yes, this is the thing, where individual development can be optimized, can be supported intentionally for the sake of coherence within groups, for the sake of the integrity of those groups, for the sake of order within those groups, and not despite those things. So we're looking for a form of communion that leverages the soul and soulfulness, creativity, artistry, shared participation. And the idea is that symbols and the co-creation of symbols are key to that. Because again, we haven't done that before. The previous institutional forms had to prioritize this collective coherence, integrity, order at the expense of individual expression. And I'm describing that as a kind of reciprocal narrowing between individual and collective, resulting or stemming from chicken and egg, the split in our psyches, in our cultures. And we're wanting to reverse that into a reciprocal opening opponent process. Yeah, and so the basic idea would be to intentionally practice a curated set of an ecology of practices that is designed to generate not only coherence but also purpose in terms of narrative identity and significance in terms of normative order. I won't go into that. But coherence, purpose, significance, mattering to ourselves and to the world, that the world matters to us, that we matter to the world, to develop wisdom in groups and in individuals. And the idea is that that ecology of practices should account for the cause of the split that we've inherited. Not only that between realism and nominalism, as I was articulating at the start of this, but also between individual and collective, for example, and between like what I'm saying is that the ecology of practices, again, in a community of practitioners with a viable worldview, situated in place, should be able to facilitate working with any different split in succession. So the idea is that um, any particular duality goes along with a story, goes along with an identity that we are someone within that story, right? And in a story, there are things that we get that we obstacles that we encounter. There's a way that we can't um there's a way that we can stay locked into a certain story that involves being stuck within certain perspectives. And the idea would be to practice in such a way that we can fully enter into stories and identities and dualities, but also let them go. And to practice doing that. And that we get to successively account for um, and resolve different splits, different dualities within our own nature, within the nature of the culture by doing that. And I should say, not just about integrating, it's not just for the sake of integrating, healing, weaving, reunifying. I'm saying that that itself is an opponent process with differentiating, separating. And we want to obviously take what can't be, hmm, take the negative and the positive, the oil and the water, and be able to recombine them when and if that's appropriate, but also take what has been confused and differentiate it. Yeah, and so we basically end up using the leveraging the tension between different pairs of opposites as a source of creativity by holding different polarities in sequence. And for in Jungian terms, that would be about leveraging the vitality of the unconscious, so that when we can inhabit the perspectives of the soul, that we allow these forms, symbols, for example, to flow through us in a way that sort of performs the function of the uniting symbol in Jung's terms. And we're going to explore a little bit more about what that means, but it's essentially what I was just talking about. That finally gets us to episode 3, Shamanism and the Logos. So a little bit more review. So it's sort of the first point where the frame of duality first emerges in this whole series. Um, we get a clear prescription for group work, as in this is the question is how can we have, in Jungian terms, the energy flow up and within into one? In groups, particularly, how can we practice in groups intentionally? I'm talking about the stage of introversion. So, how can we do introversion, Jungian introversion, in groups? Again, Jungian introversion is when the energy is flowing within, away from objects toward the subject. I think this would have to do with the second person perspective, the Geist or the we space in Vervaeke's terms. It's about how can we have how can we have consciousness of and as that unified center of awareness that doesn't belong to any one person grow and accentuate and develop. But at the same time, how can we have the energy in Jungian terms extrovert flow out and down to the many? Um, how can we experience the states of communion, common union, without devaluing personhood? And again, the requirement would be for an ecology of practices to facilitate this. Yeah, we saw that in this episode, Shamanism and the Logos, we saw that sub-languages were sort of symptomatic of a lack of unity or integration. We had this basically fourfold split into either, for example, class or caste systems, sociologically speaking, or even just in terms of role differentiation. For example, just stuff like um, r rulers, warriors, merchants, working class, um, yeah, the poor, um, basic divisions like this, where there ends up being a lack of unity or lack of integration. And unless we're practicing sociological forms that preserve that in the mat like based on biomimicry according to the brain, like n principles of the evolution of nervous systems applied to sociology. Unless we get that, then we really don't get um, enough of the real. We get anarchy, basically. There's no unity. And so that means that the proper function of the logos is to perform that both differentiation, but also reintegration of any cultural objects whether they be gods, like abstractions in a sense, although gods are not just abstractions, but also like real physical things. The whole point of the logos is that we can take sort of anything that exists, maybe in terms of, for example, those three layers of Marvin Harris, like the actual physical objects, for example. Um, can we get a sense using the logos for how that one thing uh, connects with the whole? Can we get a sense for its individuality, its particularity, its uniqueness, but also its oneness with everything? And there would be analogies at both of the other layers. So not just like actual material infrastructural objects, but also institutional forms. Can we, for example, use dialogos as a kind of meta practice as a way to bring the functionality of other practices or other um, phenomena at the social structural layer? So, for example, the laws or rules or um, methods of organization, can we bring those into view and explore their particularity, their uniqueness, their unique function, how and where they're situated within the whole? Um, this has to do with religio, and but at the same time, how can we explore how those phenomena, those I call them cultural objects, but it's not just objects, fit into the whole? How can we explore that they're connected with the one? And the same with superstructural phenomena, such as the gods, for example, or virtues, you could say. How can we explore the uniqueness of particular virtues, as an example, or the uniqueness of the gods, but at the same time, see how they fit in. Yeah, and basically, this is again the function of logos or dialogos in terms of group practice would be to perform that differentiation and reintegration of cultural objects by making such phenomena available to participatory knowing. So to so this would be a way of bringing them together into oneness. Can we experience uh, unity with any cultural phenomena by applying shamanic practice, by applying dialogos properly conceived, but at the same time, not just available to our participatory knowing, but at the same time, how can cultural objects, I've called them, be unveiled in their distinctness? And for me, this has to do with the Vervaeke stuff about internalization and indwelling. I'd refer you to episode 4 of After Socrates. I won't go on about internalization and indwelling here. A little bit more. This basically means, yeah, we have here a pretty clear normativity on the development of the skill or capacity of dialogos, where this is stuff in terms of the right means and the right man. We can avoid either sophistry as a orientation toward the right end, but with poor skill, or we can avoid sophistry, but also black magic. We can have not only the right skill, but also the right orientation. Um, so a sense of the coherence, the unity, the togetherness, that can include hierarchy of everything, but it's not limited to that. It's also about the particularity. It also includes, it's not just monotheism, it's also polytheism. You know, it's the thing is that it's about transcending and including any different duality. And so it's not just mere philosophy. And so that as a practice, let's say dialogos, it has to be able to unveil the uniqueness of each object and distinguish our relationship with it from all other relations. It would also have to reintegrate our faculties or functions, for example, in Jung, thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting, in in attendance to each object. So that would involve revealing that object or hyperobject, you could say, in its godlikeness. So we're talking about William Blake's see the world in a grain of sand. How can we experience phenomena as a portal through which we can experience a convergence, a moment of convergence of our different faculties? Um, the whole point of the logos, and by extension dialogos, is to bring back together that which has been separated and to um there's a word from alchemy that I'm looking for, distill and differentiate that which has been confused. Yeah, and that ends up being grounded in the shamanic capacity to evoke mystical experience. both in terms of receiving revelation, but also expressing and sharing. So it would be in terms of Jung's introversion and extroversion aspects of the transcendent function. And if we ground that in symbols, that looks like the capacity to form symbols by individual language and in groups, but also to understand them, to receive them, to take them in, to appreciate them. Otherwise, in episode three, and I'm almost done, I'll shut up in a minute. That basically it's this whole episode, which isn't that long, and I would say I'm expressing it there a lot more clearly than I am here. It basically leads us deeper into a sociological critique because until we restore the balance and the unity, so between and among different types of people, and until we restore balance in our psychological development, then we're essentially not going to be able to heal the split that we've inherited. This is why it's not just enough to adopt an ecology of practices. It has to be among a community of practitioners and it has to be in place. It has to be in community. This is why the Civium project dovetails so nicely because there is right now an emerging decentralized network of intentional community, and it doesn't have to be in the new age variety for it to be the right kind of prescription and a necessary and inevitable component of a prescription if we're really going to deal with the split that we've inherited. Yep, we can see from there the need for an ecology of practices, the need for the prioritization of individual development. Not at the, it's like not It's not the 20th century. Jamie Wheal expressed this as it's not cults and commies, right? It's like we need the values of the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, fraternity, um, but also like the divine worth of the individual. That was through Peterson, to be appreciated. That's the kind of whole inheritance. Is the whole point of Western culture through Christianity is that we have souls that are not to be neglected, that are actually to be taken up. It's not that they're to be tolerated. It obviously also has to do with the distinction between humans and artificial intelligence, where as AI can do more and more of the AI things, hopefully we get to do more and more of the things that humans like to do best. And that looks like expression from out of the soul, because I don't know that AI has that. Yep. And so the whole point of that is that we're talking about the evolution of forms of self-organization that are beyond the current institutions, that by virtue of that evolution can offer better solutions to the problems that beset us than the solutions that are offered by the institutions without the drawbacks of those same institutions. So we're talking about, again, we're sort of talking about the functionality of decentralized autonomous organizations. I won't go on about it. We see the need, in addition, for an orientation toward wisdom, but also for situational awareness in the context of the meta crisis. It can't just be that it's more fun to live like the Amish do, so we should do that because this is um, a regression. This is not showing up. We need to show up. We need to be aware of what the situation is and not um, burying our head in the sand, but showing up with technological facility, technological capability. Um, and that involves a recovery of pre-Holocene sociological forms or aspects of those forms. Again, just an ecology of practice isn't adequate. I'm almost finished. Yeah, and so the problem with the existing institutions is that they basically can't get deep enough into the problems because they keep telling the same stories. And one analogy would be that those stories arose after the fall into duality, into split consciousness, into history, into the human condition. And so those stories don't properly account for the split in consciousness. Um, we can't just keep telling the same old stories. We have to get facility with getting in and out of different stories based on whichever problems we're dealing with. And that involves the functionality of perspective taking and working with the soul work and work with symbols is critically important to that. We can't do it without participation in symbols. And so those institutions basically end up being afraid of their own shadows. And that's why they're caught in this loop where the more that they're afraid, the more reason they have to feel afraid. um, because the more they're afraid, the more they repress and oppress, and the more they get kind of anarchistic, tear it all down, deconstructionist response, which is not at all what I'm wanting to advocate for. I'm talking about creation. I'm not talking about destruction. Although, again, if it's really going to be beyond duality, then we have to be able to inhabit destructiveness as well. I tried to articulate that last time in terms of the Trojan horse, but again, I won't go on about it. Um, Basically, if we want our sociology to mirror the self-organizing complexity that we see in the brain via biomimicry, then we need to be able to properly integrate and cohere as well as differentiate, and that has to be done in a way which leverages the symbol forming function. And so we're looking for a way that the individual and the collective can be turned into an opponent process characterized by reciprocal opening rather than regressive repression and the Protestant Reformation kind of fall into individuality, individualism. So we're looking for a kind of participatory experience that can leverage individual expression for the sake of coherent group organization, um, where the more that we support the individual to be themselves, the more the group flourishes as a group. And what I've been trying to express is that the way to do that is by understanding that it's the symbols themselves and um, their quality of being emergent from the unconscious. They're coming through us, and their quality of being co-created. Um, it's our facility with the perspective of the soul that uh, enables our access to that place. And it's from that place that the order, the form that we're looking for emerges, not from the institutions, not from a top-down, hierarchical, same old story kind of way, but from the bottom up. Creativity as a response. Okay, and that will finally do. I now get to have done with episodes 1 through 3. The rest of them, episodes 4 through 20, I will try to review elsewhere. But I get to move into here the relativity of the God concept in Meister Eckhart, which is pages 241 through 258. Yeah, and so hmm, I'm thinking what I might do is break this up. So I'm going to stop and start again.